What's up, guys? We're going to jump into our second video series now. We did the first video series on eccentric contractions and the type of training methods that you can use with those. So during the second one now, we're going to go through the isometric methods that we talked briefly about in the table talk that we did with Dave. Now, it's important to remember that an isometric contraction, basically, we're talking about a muscle contraction that doesn't involve any changing length of the muscle. So there's no movement involved when we perform an isometric contraction. Now, this can be a good or a bad thing. First off, since there's no movement, there's going to be pretty much no muscle damage that occurs, because basically muscle damage is going to occur primarily in the eccentric phase when the muscle is being lengthened under load and the little actin myosin cross bridges are essentially being pulled apart by the load. Now, because we haven't got any movement, those cross bridges aren't being forced open or broken, so we basically get no muscle damage, which is a great thing from a recovery viewpoint, because it means we can handle a very high amount of volume of it and without struggling to recover. The downside is, because that damage and that mechanical tension is a good hypertrophy stimulus, a lot of isometric methods aren't that great for hypertrophy. Now, we are going to go through some methods that are effective for hypertrophy, but generally speaking, most isometric methods are used for improving strength. So one of the main benefits we get from isometrics is that we're going to get an increased activation during that pause of the antagonistic and the synergistic muscle groups. So as we spoke about with the eccentric contractions, we get an increased activation of the antagonistic muscle group, which is great. So think like on your squat, you're going to get more activation in your hamstring or your hip flexor, for example. But with the isometric, we also get increased activation in the synergistic muscle groups. So basically all the little muscle groups that are around those main movers that help stabilize the joint and keep us in good alignment. So from a stability standpoint, isometric contractions are going to give us more benefit compared to an eccentric contraction. Okay. Now, what that also comes with then is an increased amount of inter and intramuscular coordination. So because we're spending more time at that specific joint angle, we get better at coordinating all those muscle groups that are involved in holding that position. So not only between the muscle groups that are holding those joint angles, but also within them. So within the muscle groups, we've got all those little motor units that wire different muscle fibers. They don't always work that well together. They don't always pull in unison that well together. However, when we do isometric contractions, we contract very hard in that position for an extended period of time. We get better at wiring all those motor units to pull together in the same way so that we can create not only more force within that singular muscle, but then more force in total, because all the other muscles are then doing the exact same thing. So this is going to be a great benefit then when we go back to the full range movements. Those joint angles that we've spent more time at, we're going to be way better at producing force and also creating a more stable environment at those joint angles. So it can carry over really well to the main lifts, but it's going to be really good tool for you to help get rid of sticking points or to work through and strengthen weak ranges of motion in your main lifts. Now, when you are performing isometric contractions, it's important to remember that although we are stable and staying still during the contraction, it's not just going to strengthen that one joint angle. We do get a bit of leeway. Now, generally speaking, it's going to be, say, 10 to 15 degrees. That's going to depend basically on how good of a motor learner you are. The more kind of a natural athlete you are and the more well that you pick up new exercises and things like that, the more of a carryover you're going to get. Someone who struggles learning new movements isn't as naturally athletic, if you like, is going to get a little bit less of a carryover. But everyone is going to get a carryover probably of at least 10 degrees either side of where that isometric is taking place. So that's why it's not only good for maybe eradicating just a sticking point, but also strengthening a range. And then the other thing that we can get out of isometrics that are very hard to get elsewhere is an increased firing rate. Now, when we get up to about 80% effort during a movement, we get full muscle recruitment. So all the motor units in that muscle have been recruited as soon as we hit about 80% effort. So for example, 80% of your 1 rep max being on the bar, you get full muscle recruitment. So if we've already recruited all the muscle units, then how do we get more force if we have no more fibers to pull in to help us? That's where firing rate comes in. Firing rate basically is how fast those muscle fibers are twitching and contracting. Now that is what really will help elevate your ceiling of upper strength. And that's where a lot of your extra maximal strength development comes from when you go into peaking phases and you're lifting heavier weights. Now during isometric contractions, we get an increased firing rate that's greater than what we'd see during like a regular concentric action. And also, as we spoke about, because you're not moving, they're also less fatiguing. So we can spend more time teaching our nervous system to ramp up that firing rate without giving us a huge amount of fatigue, as if we were doing it with, say, singles at like 92% of our 1 rep max. So it's a very good method to be using then during peaking phases or heavier phases to get the nervous system response we want without the accumulated fatigue that usually comes with heavier loading. Okay, so those are a lot of the benefits that you're going to get from introducing isometric training or methods into your training. What we're going to do now is do a series of videos on different methods that you can use and why each of them have certain benefits at different stages of your training. So the first isometric method that we're going to go through today is called an overcoming isometric. This is probably the method that's most commonly known about and associated with isometric training. Basically, when we perform an overcoming isometric, the goal is to press the bar or pull the bar against an immovable object. So what this allows us to do is create a maximal amount of force without movement. Now, the main benefit that we're going to get from doing an overcoming isometric is that because the object we're pulling against is immovable, we're going to be able to ramp up the nervous system more than if we were training with an object that we can move. The big benefit of this is that we can get generally about 10% more force production during an overcoming isometric than you could ever achieve during a regular concentric action or during a regular lift. So again, for ramping up your nervous system, increasing the firing rate and getting your maximal strength up from a neurological point of view, overcoming isometrics are probably one of the best methods you can use. Now, you can use them as a standalone tool to work on a sticking point. So therefore, you just do one area or one location within the lift where you'd work. You can also use them to work on the entire range of motion as well. What you do with that is you kind of set up 3 different pin heights, and then you do sets at all 3 pin heights, or maybe 4, and then that way you're getting that increased activation across the whole range of motion. What we're going to do today is just show you one example. So Naomi is set up on the floor press here, if we just have a look. Now we've set the pin up about midpoint for her, so where the elbows are about 90 degrees. Now what she's going to do is she's going to drive up into the pin, and then for about 6 seconds, she's going to push as hard into the pin as humanly possible. Now, when you do this, the goal will be to ramp up how hard you're pushing into the pin as you go through the isometric. The problem will be is if you drive the bar up into the pin as hard as possible, go again, if you don't mind. If she goes all in from the very first second, what will happen is she's going to smash into the pin and the bar is going to bounce off the pin. It's going to make her unstable. So she presses the bar up, she gets a solid contact, and then throughout the 6 seconds, then she's going to slowly ramp up the amount of effort that she puts into that pin until the kind of the last, say, 2 or 3 seconds of it are actually really maximal effort. Awesome. Thank you. And in it goes. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so there that would be, you know, say 6 seconds we were doing there. That would be the low end of the range that you would use. Generally, what we want to do is look between 6 and 12 seconds. The idea being that we want to make sure that we're using the same energy system that we would use during a maximal lift. So we basically want to use the creatine phosphate system. We're never going to be able to use that for more than 12 seconds. So 12 seconds would be the absolute upper limit. And usually for someone like a powerlifter, that's probably going to be more than is necessary. However, if we go less than 6 seconds, what we usually find is that isn't enough time for the lifter to ramp up how much pressure and effort they're putting into the pin. So they never really end up reaching that highest peak of force production, which hopefully will be somewhere about 110% of what they could achieve on their own. So that there is an example of just using it in one sticking point. Like I said, we could have put that bar lower and done a set in the very lowest point, a set in the midpoint, and a set at the top point to improve the whole range of motion. Now, in your workouts, these are generally best done as a warm-up, either doing the full range of motion before you go into your work sets for 1 set each, or pick your sticking point and then do, say, 3 sets of 6 to 8 seconds at that sticking point before you go into your main lift. So the next isometric method that we're going to go over is called a functional isometric. So when we do an overcoming isometric, the idea is that basically we're using an empty bar so that there really isn't any effort until we start driving into the pin or whatever the immovable object is that you're using. So that there is no real movement under load at all. The difference now with a functional isometric is that we set the bar up between 2 pins so that there is actually some loaded movement before we hit the pin, and we then perform the overcoming isometric. So all a functional isometric is a partial rep followed by an overcoming isometric. Now, the reason that this can work well is because you have a concentric action before the overcoming isometric. It better mimics what will actually happen when you do the full lift. So therefore, it can translate over a little bit better. The other benefit is that we can also actually get some concentric work in, and it means that we're more likely to hit the second pin where we perform the overcoming isometric in the same position that we would hit it if we were doing the full lift. So what I mean by that is if we're just using an empty bar and we're pressing up into the pin on a bench press, there's no weight on the bar. We might end up half an inch back or half an inch further down than where we would if we were pressing the bar up in a normal bench press. Whereas when we've got some weight on the bar and we're starting on the second set of pins and then we move up, it's easier to mimic the bar path that we use when we have the full lift. Now, other than that, in terms of programming or how you perform it, it's pretty much the same. You initiate the rep from the first set of pins, you hit the second set of pins at a slowish pace so that it doesn't bounce off, and then over about 6 to 9 seconds, then you're going to build up the amount of tension that you push into that second set of pins. So again, you'll probably get about 3 seconds of really maximal effort. Now, when you do these, you're going to treat them the same as the overcoming isometric in that you're going to go 1 rep, and then do the isometric, and that would be your set done. You're not going to do several reps in one. So let's just pan over to Naomi, and what she's going to do is show us what that looks like now. So she's got it set up on the first pin. She's going to start as close to where she would be in a regular part of the lift. She's going to initiate the rep, and then press into the second set of pins as hard as she can for about 6 seconds or so. And good, bring it back down. Again, she's going to do 1 more for us so we can see what that looks like. So again, she sets back up, gets nice and tight, presses up, hits the second pin, and then drives hard into the pin. Again, about 6 seconds. You can always go a bit more if you want to. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you. Now, in terms of loading, it's going to depend a little bit on where you put the pins. For example, let's say your weak position is the bottom of a squat. You're going to be quite weak and it's going to be quite difficult to lift from a pin in that position. But generally what we want to do is have about 70 to 80% on the bar when we perform this. The reason being for that is when we get to about 70, 80%, we're going to get full muscle motor unit recruitment. Again, so it's going to slightly better mimic the recruitment pattern of when we do a heavy lift and we hit that sticking point normally. Now, the other benefit that we get from this, as opposed to an overcoming isometric, is that this is a little bit better at strengthening a range of movement as opposed to a specific sticking point, because we're taking the weight through a couple of inches of range of motion before we hit the pin. So it's going to give you a slightly better carryover to, say, a range of the lift rather than just one specific weak point. So the last kind of method that we're going to do in the functional isometric range, if you like, is going to be what's called an isometronic. Now, the problem with overcoming isometrics and functional isometrics is that we can't really do a high volume of work with them. Overcoming isometrics, there's no real movement under load. With the functional isometrics, we're getting that 1 partial rep, doing the overcoming isometric, and then we're done. Now, with a functional iso, what you generally do in your program is just kind of work up to the heaviest weight that you can push against that pin for, say, 6 to 9 seconds, and you'd be done. Even if you do several sets leading up to that top set, you're not going to get a huge amount of work done in that range. This is where the isometronics can be more useful. So basically what we do here is we do a set of partial range of motion reps between the 2 pins that we've set up, and then we perform an overcoming isometric at the end. So the benefit that we get here is that we get some rep work in the range that we're weak in, but then also when we perform the overcoming isometric at the end of the set, we're doing it in a fatigue state. So that can actually be an even stronger stimulus then for us to work on that sticking point and get an even stronger overload there, because if we're doing a maximal lift, we're never going to be 100% fresh when we hit that sticking point anyway, because we're going to have performed half a rep with 100% of our 1 round max. So it can actually carry over a little bit better there. The downside to this is because we are doing a lot of reps and then doing the overcoming iso in a fatigue state, is that they are very fatiguing. So you would do 1, maybe 2 sets of this at most. And usually the first set would be kind of like a warm-up set, which is kind of like an 8 out of 10. And then the second set would be an all-out effort. But that would be all you could do, because otherwise your performance is just going to drop way off anyway. So we're going to have Naomi demonstrate again. But what she's going to do now, she's going to perform a set of 6 reps She's then going to perform an overcoming isometric against the pin in a fatigue state. And then after the overcoming iso, she's actually going to try and get one more rep after the overcoming isometric to see if she can. So again, she sets up as she did before. Now, when she does the reps, all we're looking for on the reps is that she just touches the pin, okay? We're not looking for her to drive really hard into the pin. Just a controlled touch against the pin for the regular reps. And then once she's done her 6, that's when she really drives into the pin and ramps it up over those 6 to 9 seconds. That's it. And then drive hard, 6 to 9 seconds against the pin. She's then going to come back down after the isometric, reset, and then try and get one more rep. Perfect. And done. So that would be one set there. Now, if you get the 6 reps, a 9-second hold on the pin, and the extra rep, that would mean that you can go up next time. The extra rep there at the end is purely there as an extra stimulus to make the set more effective so that you don't have to do more of them. And basically, it's the same principle in that we're trying to work through that weak range in a more fatigued state to try and strengthen our neurological stimulus in that range. Now, the one downside of these methods, the functional isos and the isometronics, is that not everyone has the ability to set up like we have here with 2 pins or 2 sets of pins in a rack. Now, if that's you, what you can do as kind of a makeshift version of this is you can set up just the bottom set of pins, and then you can have a partner hold their hands kind of like 2 inches above. And what you do then, as you press up to their hands, they would hold their hands still and just drive down onto the bar, and that's when you'd come back down. Just to give you a bit of a stimulus or a response to where you need to go up to. And then during the isometric then, they would need to lean down and press hard down into the bar so that you can't physically move it up. Now, since you've got 70 or 80% on the bar of your 1 rep max, when you get to that sticking point and you hit their hands, you're not really going to be able to apply that much pressure extra up into their hands because it's already 80% effort to hold it still. So it can actually work pretty well. You just need a training partner that's going to pay attention, apply enough pressure down into the bar. But that can be a really good backup option for those of you that don't have 2 sets of pins to set up on. So the next methods that we're going to go over are called yielding isometric. So these are the second type of what we would call a pure isometric. So when we say pure isometric, what we're referring to is methods that basically all the work is done in a completely stationary position. So the overcoming isometrics that we went over earlier are a pure isometric because we don't really do any movement under load. Whereas the functional isometrics and the isometronics that we did, because we have partial reps involved in that method, we wouldn't class them as a pure isometric because they come with some muscle damage due to the concentric parts of the reps before them. Now, when we do a yielding isometric, it's a little bit different to what we've done previously. What we're going to do is basically just hold a load in position, or we could hold a position against gravity depending on what the movement that we're performing is. But the goal is to stay still and resist the load. Whereas when we're doing the isometrics against the pins, the goal is to drive into the pins as hard as you can. Here, the goal is resistance. So it's a little bit different, a little bit of a different firing pattern, and we're not contracting quite as hard as we would as when we're driving against an immovable object. So we don't get quite as much force production as we do during the overcoming isometrics and those variations. But what this allows us to do then is perform the isometric contraction for a much longer period of time. So what that then allows us to do is get more of a hypertrophy stimulus, because whilst we're in that contracted position for an extended period of time, what happens is we get an occlusion effect in the muscle. So because the muscle is contracted, all of the blood vessels within the muscle are contracted, so we can't get much blood flow into it. We start to build up lactate and a hypoxic condition. What this does then is actually give us a hypertrophy stimulus from the buildup of the lactate. So these types of methods now are kind of leaning more towards hypertrophy style training rather than towards max strength. So Naomi's just going to demonstrate for us with a bicep curl now what we do. She's going to perform a curl up to the midpoint, and then she's just going to hold that position. She's going to do it for about 20 seconds just for demonstration purposes here. But again, the emphasis here is not to try and lift the load up at all. We want just enough resistance that we have to work hard to hold the position and stop the weight pulling us back down. It's almost basically like flexing against a load for an extended period of time. Now, what this can be a really good tool for as well is teaching a lifter to have a good mind-muscle connection with that muscle group. You can bring them down whenever you like. So someone who, say, struggles to use their biceps or struggles to feel their biceps, by spending a lot of time in that contracted position can build up a better mind-muscle connection with them. Now, as you saw there, Naomi was performing the isometric hold in the midpoint. That's generally where we want to perform it. So when the joint angles are around 90 degrees, that is generally where we can get the strongest contraction and put the most stress on the muscle group that we're aiming for. And like I said, because of the extended time under tension, we can get a good hypertrophy stimulus from it, also from the lactate, which brings with it a load of growth factors and things like that. Now, the other way that you can use these is to perform them at the beginning or the end of a set. And again, this can be very good for A, enhancing the hypertrophy stimulus that we get, or B, building up that mind-muscle connection. So let's take someone who struggles to feel their back in a row. You could have them perform that functional isometric in the contracted position, where the back is working hardest at the beginning of the set, build up lactate in the lats and the upper back, and then when they go to do the regular reps that they would perform then during their set, they will be able to feel their back working more. Now, if you're using it for that kind of purpose, you do say like 15 to 20 seconds at the beginning of the rep, you come up and hold and squeeze as hard as you can for that time, then you go into your set of 8 to 12, whatever it might be. If you're doing them without any reps afterwards, you're just doing them as a functional isometric on their own, we want a minimum of 45 seconds under tension. Otherwise, we don't have long enough to build up enough lactate for it to be an effective stimulus. Likewise, we probably don't want to be going over 75 seconds because that means probably the load is too low for us to get enough tension in the muscle for it to be an effective stimulus. So the next yielding isometric method that we have is called a loaded stretch. So the difference that we have here is that we're going to perform the isometric work in the stretched position rather than at the midpoint or at the peak of the contractions. Like we spoke about before, now we did the dumbbell curl at the midpoint because that's where we can get the best contraction. Or we mentioned about doing it at the beginning of a set where the muscle is contracted at most, so you can get a good mind-muscle connection. Here, whatever movement we're going to do it in the stretch position, and we're just going to show you how to do it as a standalone exercise to start. Now, the benefit of loaded stretching is that A, it is going to give you more mobility, but it's also going to bring with it a lot of other benefits. So the first thing is that spending a lot of time under load in a stretch position is going to be a strong stimulus for the tendons to get thicker and stronger. Not only are they going to get thicker and stronger, but they're also going to get stronger and thicker at the very distal end of the muscle group where they attach, which is where most injuries will commonly occur because they're in a stretch position. So it's from an injury prevention point of view, loaded stretching can bring with it a lot of benefits for that. The other thing it does is that it helps you create more micro tendons within the muscle as well. So all the muscle fibers run in a big bundle like that. They're all connected by micro tendons to help keep them together and pulling in the same direction, so to speak. When we perform loaded stretches, not only do the main tendons get stronger and thicker, we also get those micro tendons that run through the muscle thicker and stronger as well, which means that muscle is actually better at working in unison and can produce more force. The other benefit that we have with the loaded stretching as well is that we get an even greater occlusion effect. So because the muscle is stretched, the blood vessels running into the muscle are even more closed, so there's even less oxygen getting into the muscle. Now, when we do this in a stretch position, not only do we get that lactate buildup, but because a muscle being stretched under load is actually a strong stimulus for mTOR and IGF-1, we actually get those benefits as well. So we get all the hypertrophy stimulus from the lactate buildup, but we also get an increased sensitivity in the IGF-1 receptors of that muscle group, and we get an increased activation of mTOR, all really strong anabolic signaling for that muscle group. So what we do with the loaded stretching is we go down into the stretch position, and then we're just going to demonstrate it with a dumbbell press here. We're going to go down into the stretch position. And the important thing to note here is that when we're in this position, we are not relaxing into this position. What Naomi's going to be doing is using her lats and her upper back to actively pull those dumbbells down as hard as possible at all times. We're not trying to relax into this like we would in yoga or something like that. The goal is to make it an effort the whole time and treat it like an eccentric action. So again, she's pulling down through the back to try and forcibly stretch the pecs more the whole time. And you can come back up. Beautiful. So the goal would be that throughout the time period that you're doing that for, as you're contracting and essentially rowing the dumbbells down, you should progressively be able to get lower throughout the time that you're doing it. And it should feel like a lot of effort from your upper back, not just from your pecs, which are being stretched. Now, when we do these as a standalone exercise, we want to be aiming for a minute minimum under tension. Like I said before, that's long enough to build up enough lactate to get a stimulus from that, but also short enough time that we can use a decent amount of load to get a good amount of force through the muscle. Now, if you're doing it from a hypertrophy point of view, 60 seconds is going to be the sweet spot that you're aiming for, maybe 45 if you want to go a little bit heavier. If your goal is for injury prevention, so you want to focus more on getting the tendons a stronger stimulus from that point of view, then you can go lighter and do it for extended periods of time. You could go anywhere up to 2 or 3 minutes total time in a set if that is your main goal, but obviously the weight will have to be considerably less. And because there's going to be less mechanical tension on the muscle, then the hypertrophy stimulus will be considerably less. For most people, for a kind of sweet spot in between, what we usually do is program like 3 sets of 60 seconds with a 60-second rest in between. That allows you to use a pretty moderate load, which means you do get enough blood flow in there and enough stimulation for the tendons. But because there's kind of not full recovery between the sets, it progressively becomes a stronger hypertrophy stimulus as you go through the 3 sets. Also, for someone who's new to this can be quite unpleasant and painful to start with, spending that long in a stretch position under load. So doing it as 3 sets of 1 minute can be way more approachable than trying to grin and bear through 2 or 3 minutes of total tension. Okay, so another really good loaded stretch variation that we like to include with a lot of people is a weighted hang. So basically this is a really good one for anyone who has tight lats or struggles with overhead mobility. All you're going to do is literally hang from a pull-up bar and then actively push yourself away from the pull-up bar to get your shoulders driving up as high as possible to stretch the lat as much as you can. So Naomi's just going to demonstrate how that's done here. She's going to get a reasonably wide grip. The wider your grip is, the easier it will be to stretch the lats. And then what she's going to do is hang, keeping her legs very slightly in front of her so that she can't overly arch up through her lower back and her thoracic spine. And then the whole time she's treating it like a shoulder press. So she's trying to push the handles up to the ceiling to get the shoulders pushing up, and then to get a great degree of stretch through the lats. Really, really simple variation that you can use at the beginning of your back workout to get a good stimulus for your lats. Now, again, we'd be looking at around 60 seconds for that as a minimum, but if you can't grip on for that amount of time, then very simply you just end up using straps, which is fine. And then if you could find 60 seconds is quite doable, then you can start adding weight. Other variations that we commonly like to put in would be with a dip. And again, if you find 60 seconds reasonably easy for a dip, you can add a weight belt and start doing like that. For lower body, for loaded stretching, we usually use something like a Jefferson curl for hamstrings, or a sissy squat or a front foot elevated split squat for quads. But you can experiment with it and get creative as you want. Okay, so the isometric method that we use most when it comes to more hypertrophy bias training is called statodynamic. So basically all this means is that we add pauses into regular reps during regular sets. Now, these can be done at all sorts of different positions for all sorts of different times. Generally speaking, though, what we're looking for is no more than 9 or 10 seconds worth of pauses per rep. As soon as you start getting higher than that, the load that you're using is going to be too low to be a good hypertrophy stimulus. So say we've got 9 seconds as a cap. That could be anywhere from 6 seconds at the beginning, at the midpoint, or it could be 3 3-second pauses split throughout the rep. Or it could even be a 9-second pause in the stretch position at the end of every rep. You can do it however you want. Now, what you can do, though, is bias which muscle groups that you work on depending on where you put the pauses. So if you're doing a compound-based movement, what you can do is pause in specific positions where certain muscles are loaded more. So we're going to have Naomi demonstrate a seated dumbbell shoulder press now. And all she's going to do is she's going to get about 2/3 of the way up, and she's going to pause for 5 or 6 seconds at that position. So she would press up. She'd pause in that position for 5 or 6 seconds. And at that point, she'd focus on squeezing her triceps hard as we can. Because since we're in the lockout position, the triceps are going to be doing more of the work in this position. And then she drives to the lockout after the pause and comes back down. Just do one more for me. So this would be how you would just introduce pauses to say, just bias the triceps a little bit more in this movement. Now, what we could do instead is to bias the front delts more. We could introduce a pause in the bottom position. So what Naomi's going to do now, she's going to press up as normal, and then she's going to come down nearly all the way to where the front delts are loaded the most in the movement. She's going to pause there for 5 or 6 seconds. So now the front delts are taking most of the load and under a bit of a stretch. So therefore, they're going to get recruited more in that pause. Perfect. That's it. Thank you very much. So like I said, you could do, say, one pause in a compound movement to target a specific muscle group more, Or if you're doing isolation movements, you could put a singular pause in either the stretched position or the contracted position, depending on what kind of benefit you want from it more. When you put it in the stretched position, you're generally going to get a bit of a better hypertrophy stimulus, because being under load in a stretched position is a good hypertrophy stimulus itself. Whereas if we do it in the contracted or the peak position, generally we're going to be better at contracting that muscle and building a better mind muscle contraction. So the other thing that you can do here is, rather than doing the pauses on every single rep, is you could just introduce them on the first rep or even just at the end of the set. So just take, for example, a dumbbell press. You could do your regular reps of a dumbbell press, and then if you wanted to put more emphasis onto your pecs, on the last rep, you could do a hold at the bottom in the stretch position for as long as humanly possible. And then you would finish the set as soon as you can't hold that stretch for any longer. The other way you could do it would be to do that at the beginning, to pre-fatigue the pecs before you go into the regular reps then, so that they're partially fatigued. You've got a buildup of lactate, and then you can feel them working better during the set. So if you struggle to recruit them during presses, that will work better for you. Or, for example, if you're pec dominant and you find that they end up taking most of the load, you could pre-fatigue them at the beginning of the set with a hold there. And that means then, since they're fatigued, they can't dominate the movement, and that will allow the front delts and the triceps to do more of the work. Now, the main benefit for introducing these pauses into hypertrophy style work is that we get more time under tension, and also then we don't have to do as much weight to get the same stimulus. As long as we're hitting like an RPE 8 or 9 on our movements here, you're going to get pretty much the same hypertrophy stimulus. So if you're someone who's already pushing really hard on your main movements for strength work, then you can get a better stimulus from less load and beat your joints and your tendons up less than with less weight on your accessory movements to leave you feeling better for that heavier work next time. Okay, so the last isometric method that we're going to go over today is supramaximal holds. So these are really useful to use kind of towards the end of your training cycle when your weights are getting heavier and you want to try and peak. Basically, all we're going to do is hold supramaximal weights in the lockout position for anywhere between 6 and 12 seconds. Basically, we want to stick to the same energy system that we're going to use during maximal reps. We want to use the creatine phosphate system. So again, anything over like 10 to 12 seconds is going to be excessive, because we're not going to be able to use that energy system, and then the loads are going to be too light anyway. Technically, these are basically just a functional isometric with a supramaximal hold at the end, because what we're going to do is basically press off a pin, move it about an inch, and then hold it for anywhere in that 6 to 12 second range. Now, the goal of this is to be able to handle supramaximal loads. So we're looking to go over 100% of our 1 rep max. Ideally, we want to get to the position where we can hold about 110 to 120% of what we want to lift during our next test. Now, what the main benefit we're going to get from these is that, A, we're going to desensitize the Golgi tendon organs, which are basically like the body's handbrake mechanism that try to stop us producing more load. More force, I'm sorry. But the other benefit that we're going to get is that we're going to, A, teach ourselves how to develop more full body stiffness under that load, which will obviously carry over to them when we're doing the full lift. And also it can be really useful for building lifters' confidence then, so that they're not shocked when they get under the heavier loads that they're going to lift towards the end of their training cycle. So Naomi's just going to demonstrate for us over here. See how she's set up with the pin pretty high, so that she only has to move it maybe an inch before she's in the lockout position. She's going to press it up and then hold with the elbows locked in that position. And all she's going to do during that time is focus on locking her body in as tight as possible, complete full body tension from her feet all the way up into her hands, and make her body as stable and rigid as possible during that hold. And down. Perfect, thank you. When you're performing these, generally you do it one of two ways. You'd either use it as like an activation tool before your heavy lifting, in which case you want them to be reasonably difficult, but not really, really hard and neurally demanding. So you'd want to do about maybe 110% for like a couple of sets of 6 seconds, very similar to how you'd program overcoming isometrics at the beginning of your workout for an activation tool. Or you can use them as a standalone exercise to try and build up that neurological stimulus, in which case you basically ramp up to the heaviest weight that you could hold in that 6 to 10 second range. And then you might perform a few drop sets, say 2 or 3 drop sets at about 90% of that. Now, we've shown you here how you can do it from pins, where you do a slight partial movement before you hold them. That can be really useful for just general strength athletes, people who are training to be strong. Now, if we're talking with powerlifters specifically, it can actually be better to do it with an unrack. So basically you'd walk the bar out of the squat rack or you'd unrack the bar out of the bench press, because at the end of the day, when they compete, the unrack or the walkout is going to be part of the lift. So that can help them actually get used to walking out that heavier weight or unracking that heavier weight from the rack, which is all part of their setup. And that will actually carry over better to when they're lifting at the competition then. Until next time, guys.